Hi, class. This is the lecture on precision. Uh, for part of the lecture, we're going to go through what the Dowden says about it, specifically about when we lose precision and some ways it could go wrong and fix it. But before we do that, I think it's also important to talk about why it matters and maybe do a little more general introduction than the text gives. So, when we talk about precision, we talk about saying what we mean. And that's important. Uh, as we've already seen in arguments, if your conclusion says more than you intend, it's probably a bad argument. And so we're seeing that right now politically. Uh, a lot of GOP Republicans say, oh, my constituents are against abortion, and they've been passing these anti abortion laws that end up being very unpopular. Why? Because they're more against abortion than many of their constituents. So while it's true that more than 50% of their constituents are against, say, convenience based abortion, um, it's not true that more than 50% of their constituents are against a lot of the other cases, such as rape, health of the mother, severely underage, and things like that. And so, because views are not clearly articulated that this is what I'm for and this is what I'm against, you get these kind of confusions and uh, things like that. But notice also, if I'm, say, making an ethical argument for or against abortion, if I am not sufficiently precise as to which abortions I'm against, the different ethical principles cover different cases. And so you might have a premises that just don't support the conclusion you want. Sorry. And so precision is very important for achieving the strength and cogency of the arguments we want to make and evaluate. But there's other reasons as well. So precision is saying what we mean, and precision then comes in degrees. But one thing that Dowden rightly points out, though, is that degrees come uh, are relevant for context. So if you think of if you're giving your weight, if you're giving your weight um, at the DMV and they ask you how much you weigh, well, the purpose of the weight there is so you have an accurate, roughly accurate description on your license. Important if the police pull you over, etc. By contrast, if you are giving your weight, say, before a surgery for the anesthesiologist, it is much more important to be precise about your weight because that's in most surgeries, the anesthesia is the most dangerous part. And so, just as a simple example, that the degree of precision required is always, not usually, always a matter of the context in which it is given. And so remember that. Let me just give one more example of why it's important. It's pointed out a lot in terms of language. Uh, there was at the end of World War II, the Allies had just bombed Nagasaki. We're waiting for Japan's response. The uh, prime minister was interviewed by reporters, and the answer he gave about the bombing of Nagasaki was sorry, my Japanese is not good. Makusatsu, which is derivative from the Japanese word for silence, but it was an ambiguous word. It could be translated as take into account, that is, uh, to remain silent on something in that case means to think about it, or it could also be to be treated with silent contempt. And some of the US's people translated it as the latter. And then we had uh, the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, killed 70,000 people instantly, and other at least 100,000 from radiation and effects. And so there you're talking about 170,000 people who died due to a lack of precision in language. So that's an extreme case. There are other extreme cases like that, but precision is important because That's the only way to be a clear vehicle to convey what you mean. And that, as we've seen in the course, is very important. What are you willing to support? So, one of the written exercises will ask you to think a little more about some cases when precision mattered in your life, just to really emphasize this stuff does matter. It's not, we're not being pedantic here. We're getting it right. If you go on to graduate school, for instance, or even writing senior papers that are within your major, you're going to have to be precise. And so, learning some of the tricks and craft in this chapter will help you be a better communicator. So, Dowden says there are 3 ways that we fall short of sufficient precision. Again, that's all with the asterisk of based on whatever context. Things can be ambiguous, vague, or overly general. Those are 3 different things, and they all have precise definitions uh, that make it clear that they're different. Those are not synonyms. So, first of all, there's a couple of different kinds of ambiguity, but what is indicative of ambiguity is not that there's no distinct meaning, but that there are multiple distinct meanings. So ambid, like ambidextrous, there's 2 or more distinct meanings. So this could be the case with uh, the Makusatsu example I just gave. Well, there's 2 distinct meanings. It was an ambiguous word. Or we could even have ones that are the same word with 2 very, very different meanings. So bat, the flying mammal, or bat, the thing that was used in the baseball game last night, is ambiguous. Um, Different ambiguities are different levels of kind of danger depending on uh, what our context is. Sometimes you can tell which one is intended based on context. So those are ambiguous. When you intentionally use an ambiguity, that is another fallacy. That is called equivocation. And so sometimes people will do shady stuff like that. Um, but how do we fix that? We disambiguate, we make clear what is intended. But that's very different than vague. Something is vague when it's not clear where the lines are. There are borderline cases, or there's not a clear definition of what falls into it. So, uh, tall might be a vague word. Um, well, we know just by glancing at somebody sometimes that they're tall or they're not, but where does tall stop? Is is someone tall if they're 6 feet, but not tall if they're 5'11" and 15/16 inches? Uh, some that's an example of a word that's inherently vague. Sometimes people just need to do better and stipulate what they mean. So getting rid of vagueness is called precisifying. You're making it more precise. And that's just important for saying what we mean, because if we use these vague terms, then we might not convey what we intend. So I think that's pretty straightforward. We'll generate some more examples in the exercises this week, but let me just say just a few more. Well, smart is vague, wealthy is vague, words like that. And notice this, those can create communication barriers. So if you see a headline that says something like, well, wealthy people tend to vote GOP and intelligent people tend to vote uh, Democrat. Well, those are those headlines don't mean much unless you make your terms much more precise, and of course back it up with some sort of data. And then the last way for a lack of sufficient precision is when things are overly general. So first of all, it helps to distinguish three different types of generalization. There's a universal generalization where you're saying something about every class being part of the predicate. So if I said something like adult humans are over a foot tall, that would be a universal generalization because it applies to every adult. But then the tricky one is non-universal generalizations. If I said adults are over 5 feet tall, well, now I've said something that is true as a non-universal generalization, which is to say, if I mean most or many, that's certainly true. But notice we can't really infer much out of it. And so a better way to treat non-universal generalizations is to turn them into statistical generalizations. If I then instead said 99.4% of adults are over 5 feet tall. Now I know what to do with that data and I can make my inductive inferences accordingly. And so once more, the way to fix overly general, first of all, don't use them if they don't have any meaning. If you just want to talk about some, say some. If you want to talk about most, say how many. But on the flip side, the Dowden rightly points out that things could be overly precise. And there, it's not because there's too much precision so much as there's precision we can't have. And this is what he calls pseudo-precise. So we could either have too many details or we're trying to quantify something with a higher degree of precision than is warranted. And so how do we do that? We try to quantify something that can't be quantified. Tacos are twice as good as hot dogs. Well, that doesn't mean anything. Well, it means something. It means I like tacos better than hot dogs. But beyond that, the actual quote unquote precision is made up. It doesn't add anything because it can't be quantified. Now, if you said something like twice as many people surveyed preferred tacos to hot dogs, well, now we have something that we can use and support. But notice we've said something different. So then we could also have things that just can't have the precision that we want. The example he gave is the height of Bonaparte done to 10 millionths of an inch or something like that. Like height just doesn't admit to those kind of things except in a very careful lab setting. It doesn't apply to human heights, especially because human heights change in the day during more than that, just based on losing of cells and compression of the spine. Why am I talking about this? Anyway, there's places where we can't have the degree of precision, and so it doesn't add anything. And then lastly, there's just ones that can't be justified. That well, the precision sounds fishy because it's the kind of precision that we can't have. The example he gives the age of the river from from the anecdote. But anyway, so those are things that are overly precise, and you might want to think in terms of we want to avoid artificial precision just as much as we want to avoid vagueness and ambiguity. That if we are we're not contributing to our case at all unless our sole job is to try to fool somebody. And that's why we really worry about these. The cases of pseudo precision sound a lot like deliberately misleading people, and that's why you want to listen for that. It's like some of the intentional fallacies. It's a sign that something skeezy is going on. One last thing we want to pay attention to in terms of precision, specifically when we're looking at generalizations, is what's called the operationalization. So the operationalization is it's an operation in the sense of telling you what to do, but it's the way used to determine if a term applies. So if I said, well, Smart people tend to vote liberal. And you say, okay, well, how did you define smart there? And you talk about having completed college degrees. It is true that people who complete college degrees vote liberal, but notice that's not the same as saying it's true that smart is to be equated with achieving college degrees. I know plenty of smart people who don't have a degree, and I know plenty of people who are not smart who do have a degree. And so that operationalization is improper and basically made us lose precision. And that's an operationalization. Uh, and to be clear, not all operationalizations are bad. If, to use the other example, if I said, well, uh, rich people tend to vote GOP, and I say, well, what do you mean by rich? And they say, well, people who make over 20 times the poverty line. I mean, it's stipulative. I'm stipulating, but it's not a bad definition of rich. And so, by the way, these stats are all made up. I hope you don't think I hope you don't think I'm drawing these from something. I'm just giving examples. So we should always pay attention to the operationalization because that'll tell us a lot about whether we should accept the generalization, we should accept the claims as precise or not. Lastly, I want to say a few words about definitions. The textbook gives 7 different types of definitions, and by the way, it's a pretty standard list. So what's going on with the definitions and why do we do it? So people often think that definitions are ways of making things more precise, getting rid of vagueness and ambiguity, etc. And sometimes they do. But it's important to realize that also sometimes they don't. And that's not because the definition is bad, it's because definitions do different things. And so if we learn what type of definition is being given, then that tells us whether the definition is contributing in the way we think it is. And so it's really good to pay attention to those, recognize the differences when we use different definitions. So they're pretty straightforward in the text, but I'll run through them briefly. So the important one for this chapter is called a precising definition. A precising definition does what I mentioned earlier, precisification. That is, it takes a vague term and makes it not vague. That's what a precisification does. Sorry, a precising definition does. So if I have a vague term like rich, and I make it precise, or tall, say, well, someone is tall if they're in the 4th sigma of the bell curve of height. That's a precising definition, and those are the ones we want to pay attention to. It's not the next one on the list, but I'm going to say by contrast, there's lexical definitions. A lexical definition is the one you'd find in a lexicon. That is a dictionary. So a lexical definition is a dictionary definition. What do dictionaries do? And this drives me crazy because for some reason I cannot convince my students of this ever. I don't know what evil person in high school convinced all their students that you should start papers with lexical definitions. Lexical definitions, dictionary definitions, all they do ever is attempt to capture common usage. That is, they attempt to describe how this word is used in the society in which you live. That's it. Now that's important. If I have not heard a word before or I am traveling to a different country, that's hugely important. But they are in no way authoritative. If we have a dispute about what a word means in terms of fuzzy categories and things like that, to try to get rid of vagueness, a dictionary definition doesn't do it because it just captures a normal definition, a normal way of looking at things. And so they carry no authority at all. None, none, none. So quit starting your papers with Webster's dictionary defines justice as bippity boppity boo. It doesn't, it's silly. That's that's like if we took a vote to determine what justice was. That's nonsense. So that, again, this is why we're going through the types of definition though. Well, Lexical definitions are really important in certain contexts. If I read a word that I haven't encountered before in a novel, love to have the lexical definition. If I am trying to understand a word in Spanish, love to have a lexical definition. If I'm writing a term paper about the concept of justice and whether the capital punishment is just, useless. Worse than useless. It's just going to irritate your professor. So quit doing that. But anyway, other definitions. Ostensive. Ostensive is, in a sense, the weakest definition, but it's important because, well, what is an ostensive definition? Literally, to ostend is to point. So, what's a human? One of these things. That doesn't give you a whole lot of information because think of all the things I could be pointing at here. Well, I could be describing what we think of as human, or what I think of as human male, or what I think of as bald, or what I think of as skull, or so ostensive definitions are the weakest definitions. And yet, they do fill this really important role because that's how we all start. That's the start to language. If you have ever encountered a baby in your life, you start teaching them language by pointing at that and saying book. So that's what ostensive definitions are. By contrast, that one calls them definitions by example. Most textbooks call them definition by enumeration, where you just list some things. So philosophers are people such as Socrates, Plato, Descartes, and Hume. Would be a definition by example. And in some ways, it's almost like we pointed at four different things. And so the definition is presumably you're trying to figure out what they all have in common. So that's definition by example or enumeration. The last three, though, are the ones that we want to pay some extra attention to. So a stipulative definition is where we stipulate. That is, I am either creating a new word, that almost never happens, but or using a word in a new way. So in my in a book I wrote, there's kind of this standard group of complicated things we need to understand when dealing with the problem of evil and philosophy of religion. And it didn't have a name, but it was really important. And so I said, let's call this a presentation of theodicy. And it's a stipulation. So I said, and this is what I mean by it. And so it's stipulative is you are specifically creating a word or use for a word that it did not have before. One of those kind of, for the purposes of discussion, this is how I'm using that word, might be another version of a common way stipulative definitions come up. Persuasive definitions are what it sounds like. A persuasive definition is trying to make you feel a certain way about the word being defined. And we should watch those because, just like the fallacies, they're tricks. We shouldn't try to persuade you with the definition. That's not the job of definitions pretty much ever. Whenever you're doing a persuasive definition, you're doing something wrong. So, lastly, though, operational. Operational definitions are kind of cool because they tell you how to determine they tell you the operationalization. So if I defined an acid as something that turned a litmus paper red or pink, whatever it is, that's an operational definition. That doesn't actually tell me what an acid is, but it tells me how to determine if something is an acid, which when we're talking precision is actually very important. So those are 7 different things definitions can be doing. And they each have uses. And because precision is important based on context, then how we are making things precise through definitions is also important to realize, well, what context, what definitions are appropriate and what are not. So expect lots of practice on that. Really good to come up with your own definitions of each type. I think I'll probably ask you to do that in the exercises, and practice being more precise. Again, what degree of precision do you want? Exactly what you're trying to claim in context. So enough to support your views. That's what you need. And you should never do more, and you should never do less. Otherwise, we will see you next time.